Well, welcome, Stanford students and our global audience to the Entrepreneurial Thought Leaders series. I'm Luke Sikora, Head of Content at STVP, and ETL is presented by STVP, the Entrepreneurship Center in Stanford's School of Engineering, and BASE is the Business Association of Stanford Entrepreneurial Students. Today, we are really thrilled to welcome Juliet Anammah and Darius Teeter to ETL. Juliet is the chairwoman of Jumia Nigeria and Chief Sustainability Officer of Jumia Group, which is the largest e-commerce platform in Africa and was the first African tech startup to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. She oversees institutional relationships, corporate communication, and ESG as well for Jumia across 11 countries in Africa. She previously served as the CEO of Jumia Nigeria for more than 4 years, overseeing growth and transition of Jumia Nigeria from online retail into a full digital ecosystem that includes marketplace and logistics and payment services as well. And I'm sure we'll be hearing about some of that shortly. Today's ETL is also a collaboration between STVP and Stanford Seed, which is an initiative within Stanford's Graduate School of Business that partners with entrepreneurs in emerging markets to build thriving enterprises that transform lives. And we're very happy to have Stanford Seed Executive Director Darius Teeter here to host this conversation with Juliet. Before joining Stanford Seed, Darius served as Vice President of Global Programs for Oxfam America. He has a BA in History from Yale and a Master in Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. And if you're inspired by this conversation and want to learn more about the entrepreneurial climate in Africa, really encourage you to check out his podcast. It's called Grit and Growth. It tells the stories of entrepreneurs in Africa and South Asia, and also connects those stories to relevant perspectives and strategy insights from Stanford GSB faculty. And we'll pop a link to that podcast in the YouTube live chat. Welcome, Juliet and Darius. And with that, I will turn the session over to Darius.
Thanks so much, Luke. Welcome, Juliet. So I have a bunch of questions. We'll try to do what we can do, but I also want to give students and other participants a chance to ask theirs as well. But I wanted to kick it off. Luke gave a very brief introduction to Jumia. But for those of us who don't know much about it, can you tell us just a little more? What are the problems that Jumia is trying to solve?
Yeah, thanks, Darius. So Jumia is an e-commerce platform, the largest e-commerce platform in Africa. And we started in 2012. And we started with a mission, very simple mission that, we could improve lives with the power of the internet on the continent. And we are based in about 11 countries. And the 11 countries where we're based in actually cover 70% of Africa's GDP and about over 500 million internet users. So the question is, like you said, what's the problem we're trying to solve? If you're a seller in Africa many years ago, you only had two options on how you're going to retail your products to consumers. Either you had to pay a very expensive high street real estate prices for a modern retail shop, or you had no other alternative but to operate in the open market. Very informal open market. Is hot, it has no amenities or utilities, and it's overcrowded. Those were the only options you had, especially if you were a small, medium enterprise just trying to get by. So Jumia solves that problem for a host of millions of SMEs and sellers and merchants on the continent, because you don't have to register on Jumia platform. You don't have upfront capital expenditure in terms of putting up retail space. Literally minutes once you're registered and gone through the training for selling online on Jumia, you can start your business. So that's a huge part of the problem. The second part of the problem, of course, was a logistics problem. So the first one was a distribution problem. And even just staying on the distribution one, if you were a consumer, by the time you finally buy the product, chances are that the markups from the very long distribution chain from manufacturer to bulk breaker to wholesaler and finally to retailer and the neighborhood shop where you buy the item, you're could be paying significantly more than you should as a consumer. So one was a distribution problem from the consumer's perspective and from a seller's perspective. So we're bringing millions of consumers to interact and transact with sellers directly, with no intermediaries or any other agents in between. The second part of it is the logistics part of it. We're also solving a logistics problem by integrating multiple logistics partners into one single integrated logistics, what we call, it used to be called in my old Accenture days as a 4PL, but what it is that you're using technology to integrate different asset owners, and then using Jumia's technology to also be the, manage the data and how they operate. So those are the two
can I ask a quick question about that?
Yeah,
so
sure,
Jumia doesn't own the logistics supply chain, but it has a platform that allows you to get the right players in there when you need them, where you need them.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's an asset light model, and where a lot of the investment that is required, because you have people who have the assets, you have people who have tricycles and vans and so on. But what was lacking was always the technology to integrate that together and to use the data to make quality decisions of where do you deliver, what timeline is it required, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And what about payments? I mean, I'm really curious because I love this transformation. I want to get back to the transformation for the informal sector that's implied in everything you just said. But what about payments?
Exactly. So payments was another part of it, because I still remember about 2015, just not too long ago, if a consumer made a purchase on Jumia and we relied on just the payment through a card, a debit card or a credit card, and had to clear on the back end with a bank. Sometimes if there was a return, it could take 2 weeks, because of course the banks at the time, e-commerce was not really something that they were really focused on. So we had to develop our own payment system, again, using the same principle of integrating different payment methods that a consumer could have into a seamless platform that will allow us to clear whether it was credit card or debit card or mobile money or bank transfer, whatever payment method that the consumer had, we could also integrate it on that network. So that's the third component, and that's why those are the three parts of our ecosystem. Yeah.
I'm curious. So I want to dig down a little bit more into the payments piece. I'm going straight into the weeds because that's where I love to be. But are you using third-party payment providers? I mean, there's so many startups now in this space, fintech space in Nigeria. There's a lot of venture capital flowing in. There's Lydia, PayHippo. There's just I've lost track of how many of them are. Are you doing your own thing, or you're working with all of these third-party providers?
We're agnostic. So we're working with all third parties, yeah. And especially given how large the market is, the real value you bring to consumers is not limiting them to your own solution. It's actually giving them a platform through which they could use whatever payment methodology that they have. Yeah.
It's actually substantially more sophisticated than what it's like here in the United States. I'm always struck by that. Like, people are so excited that they can buy their Starbucks coffee with their phone, and people were doing that in the Philippines 9 years ago, 10 years ago. So yeah. I feel like we're catching up because of the dominance of credit card companies. So tell me a little bit about what is using data, what is the transformation you're seeing in the informal sector thanks to platforms like Jumia's?
It's huge. Because look at it. You look at the number of sellers in Africa who are small, medium enterprises in the informal market. And then when they get onto Jumia, look at the kinds of information that is available to them. Suddenly they know, for example, which ones of their items are the fastest moving, what price points, which particular color. If you're a fashion seller on Jumia, you suddenly know whether it's the blue shirt or the red shirt that actually sells better than the other SKUs that you have. That's very powerful information. They get information in terms of even the placement of the products, the product information which they put up on site. They get information on their seller score and all that. So really formalizing informal trade is it's a huge benefit that e-commerce, an e-commerce platform like Jumia is bringing to to the sellers in Africa. So that's a huge part. That's a really big transition from where they were before. Yeah.
So that I love that. That's the data analytics piece, which is for some of them, I think probably data they've never had, or they had intuitively, or they had it on pen, paper and pen.
Yeah.
Can you tell how many of your sellers are new sellers? I mean, in other words, that they would not be in a marketplace if it wasn't online.
Oh yes, we ran a survey recently, and I might be able to share some of that information just in ranges. And we have sellers, in between 30% to 40% of our sellers who say, look, they started their business exclusively on Jumia, right? And some sellers start their businesses on Jumia. Some sellers came to Jumia to expand their businesses. But what I actually find extremely interesting is the number of women sellers that we have on Jumia. So we have, at least in Nigeria and Kenya, which are key markets, about 51% of our sellers are actually women. And why do women find it attractive? It's a gender agnostic environment. I mean, you could be a fashion seller, you could be an electronic seller, and you don't have it's not a physical market where someone can make those kinds of gender-related decisions, or whether I want to buy an electronic product from a woman or not. So that is giving them, access to different categories that they could perform in. Two, it is also giving women flexibility to be able to manage their homes and at the same time run a business of their own. Then third component that women say they really appreciate selling on Jumia, it's the training. It's training on digital marketing, training on how to sell online, training on even how to read your account statements, just those basic kinds of training. The importance for an SME just cannot be overemphasized. Yeah.
Oh, I love that point. We in Stanford Seed, we're always trying to get more women CEOs into our program. And we commissioned a study to look at what are some of the barriers to entry for women entrepreneurs across the African continent. And you just hit a bunch of them. Access to capital. Like if you want to open a storefront, it's going to be super hard to find that $50,000 or $100,000 loan. The second is access to networks.
Yeah.
Women traditionally, not just in Africa, but across the world, have trouble accessing networks. And then the third is access to technology. And I include training under technology, right? That is the most basic technology.
Yeah.
You're not getting the same opportunity. So those are really powerful elements of the platform. Yeah. That's exciting.
And there's a fourth element to it, actually, and that's access to, because you talked about some of the fintech providers of financial services. So through Jumia, because we have Jumia Lending, we are also able to connect a lot of sellers to loan opportunities, to finance their working capital. So there are multiple.
Say a bit more about that. What is Jumia Lending?
So Jumia Lending connects sellers on our platform, leveraging their transaction data, transaction history, to then find working capital loans through other financial services providers who are partners to Jumia. So we don't lend off our balance sheet. We do the connection through to financial services providers.
It makes total sense to me because in interviewing a number of fintech CEOs for my podcast, they're all using algorithms and machine learning as alternative sources of data for assessing creditworthiness. And the number one thing they use for little like working capital loans for trading companies and retailers is, what's your repayment history? Yeah. And it's not coming from banks because banks aren't doing $500 loans, right? Yeah. So, but the other one would be, what's your revenue history, right? So if you can show that from Jumia, hey, this is my monthly revenue. Yeah. That's hugely valuable to those fintech algorithms because that's the data they need. That's interesting. There's a great question here. I'm going to just, instead of doing the 45 minutes and then questions, I just want to jump in on this one because this is actually a direction I wanted to go. Yeah. The question is, how does Jumia evaluate markets for potential entry? And do you ever decide markets are no longer viable? And the person who's asking this question mentions that Jumia pulled out of Cameroon.
Yeah.
I want to tack on my own question to that. You mentioned you're in 11 countries, 500 million people, and accounting for some enormous percentage of the total GDP on the continent. Can you go to this question and talk a little bit about the barriers to regional expansion and what you look for when you pick a new country to enter?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and that the questioner was actually right. Yeah, we had to pull out of Cameroon. Remember, there was a time when Cameroon, the internet was shut down for almost a whole year. Okay, so these are very important factors that we look at. We look at the state of the economy. We look at beyond GDP, beyond economic factors. We're also looking at readiness for an internet-based business like ours. So those are very important nuances that we consider in terms of looking at expansion. For now, we're deepening our footprints within the countries that we are in. Maybe in the future, but certainly for this year, we're really concentrating on those 11 countries where we're currently in.
Is your phrase readiness, is that code for regulatory environments?
It could be regulatory. So for example, in some cases, you find that readiness, of course, internet access, reliability of internet access are very important factors. A cost of data for consumers is also very important. Now, to the extent that those are determined by regulatory factors, then that's where the link is, right? So those are just examples there.
Is there an issue around business licenses for, I mean, I can't tell you, I worked in the development sector, how many projects I saw that, were, the title was formalizing the informal sector. And I'm always thinking that's a terrible idea if it means, chasing people around for unpredictable taxes, but is that an issue too, by business registration and licensing? No.
To a large extent, no, except for areas that are quite regulatory in any market, which is really when it comes to financial services.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it hasn't been, from just the business registration perspective, we find that a lot of governments in Africa are actually quite supportive. Yeah. And bear in mind, post-COVID also, they realized the importance of digital platforms, and a lot of governments are quite supportive and doing as much as they can to make sure that companies like us are operating well.
Let's talk about COVID for a second. How important was COVID and the lockdowns a determining factor in the growth of e-commerce? Is it just a blip in an otherwise rapidly growing bow wave, or was it determinative in your growth?
I think it was a blip in Africa. I mean, look at it in the US here. The US government more or less bankrolled retail during COVID, right? So put money in people's accounts and you're sitting at home. What are you going to do? You have to spend the money online, right? So the Fed bankrolled retail during the pandemic. You don't have that equivalent in other areas like Africa. And in some cases where we had intermittent lockdowns and movement restrictions. So it wasn't such a big factor in terms of growth of e-commerce. Rather, e-commerce had been on a trajectory, given the fact that you have, like I said, you have over 500 million internet users. Africa is also a mobile first environment. Right. So it's almost like Africans have been hungry to do more with their mobile phones. And e-commerce just happened to be one of those areas. If there's any area where I think there was a lot more awareness during COVID about the potential of e-commerce, it's in the public policy and public agency environment, where they suddenly realized that this is something that can actually be leveraged in a situation like a pandemic, and has great potential for jobs and great potentials for economic development as well.
Well, I want to use that as a segue to learn a little bit more about you. So you were CEO of Jumia Nigeria for 4 years, coming from a decade as the director for Accenture in Nigeria. That's a big shift. What inspired you to make that move? What did you see on the horizon?
Several things. I mean, I'd been, like you said, I'd been in consumer goods, had been in Accenture. I was partner for consumer goods responsible for all our clients in West Africa region. When I joined Jumia, I was the CEO for 4 years and some months. So as far as the market environment was concerned, I had enough experience in that area, understood everything about, distribution, route to market, supply chain, consumers, and so on and so forth. But here was the non-market environment, and with great potential to impact the trajectory of any industry. I mean, one policy, look at what happened with data protection and how it impacted a lot of big tech companies and so on. So I realized how important it was that we developed a structured approach in which we could engage with policymakers so that they understood the value and the potential of e-commerce and the digital economy, and could work with us in shaping the policy environment for it, to nurture it to grow. So that's why I decided this was a very important area for me to look at. And the more I looked at it, then of course I also saw other opportunities in sustainability and
I definitely want to drill down on the sustainability issues and your new role as chairwoman for Jumia and chief sustainability officer. So, but I want to, since you brought up regulation again, I want to just take one quick detour there.
Yeah.
And in speaking with a lot of tech-enabled companies, fintech, medtech, health tech, the common complaint is that, not so much a complaint, but the observation is that we recognize that there's a role for regulation to protect consumers. The problem is when the regulatory authorities are not at the cutting edge of what's happening. So the regulations themselves, even if they come from a place of good intention, they may actually be a hindrance or a barrier to growth. And so what's needed is a dialogue. And so my question to you is there a group of companies and people like yourself who are collaborating to work with regulators to say, let's get this right together?
Yeah, definitely. So just on the context, people say that regulators, that they're not on the same plane, but it's our responsibility as private sector to educate, right? And a lot of my work in the past year and so has been that education, providing information to say, look, this is what we're doing. To a large extent, we've actually spent more time just explaining this is what we're doing. This is what a marketplace model looks like. These are the responsibilities of the platform versus the seller, versus the consumer and all that. So I think it's our responsibility as private sector to do it, and that's what we've been doing. Okay. In some of our markets also, we've formed coalitions with like-minded private sector companies in Nigeria. We have the eCommerce group within the Lagos Chamber of Commerce. I am actually the first chairwoman of that council. In Kenya, we have a private sector alliance, and we have an e-commerce sector within the alliance. So all of those are opportunities to engage with regulators. And it's always to the interest of private sector to engage early. That way you can provide the necessary information and education and dialogue, because they want to do the right thing. They just want to be well informed in taking the right decision. Sometimes you provide parallels from other markets. You can show what's going on in the US or China, and how the African environment is different, and you make your recommendation, and they listen.
Yeah, I think in some sense, because you have first movers advantage, I think for some fintech operators in some countries, their problem is that the banks are actually in front of them trying to advocate for restrictive policies because the banks are worried about being disrupted. So they have a lot more leverage, right? And they've been around longer. So, but I think that's probably less of a problem in e-commerce. I want to now pivot to sustainability. We've had a couple of questions in the Q&A about sustainability. You are responsible for sustainability for the group. What does that mean for Jumia? What are some of the key initiatives that you're focused on, or the organization is focused on in the sustainability space?
The first thing for us is actually a very clear validation that our mission itself is sustainable. Okay, so we don't have to invent some new projects to go after. I mean, it doesn't mean, of course, we would have to operate in a sustainable manner, reducing in terms of our shipments, reducing use of packaging materials and all that. So all of those are very important hygiene factors, which we build into our day-to-day operation. But just realizing that our mission, which is about, in the end, when you look at it, is about reducing inequality, is so critical and is a big part of how we create value and how we create sustainable improvement in quality of lives on the continent. And asking ourselves, what more can we do with that mission? And second part of it is that we have a full ecosystem of many partners that working together can actually, create more value for the communities that we live in than just Jumia itself. We have sellers, we have third-party logistics partners, we have brands who work with us. So that's a full ecosystem that if we deploy, can actually do a lot more for sustainability. So that's our focus, and that's our area of attention for this first year. I mean, this is the first year that we're actually, putting together our practices, what we're doing, and we would have a report, our first report next year. Yeah.
So those are strong and admirable principles, but for our audience, help me make it concrete. Is this about carbon footprint? Is it about, do you have KPIs in the sustainability space? And you can push back because you just said it's year one. So, I get it. We're just getting started here, but help me make it practical. Help me make it real.
Yeah, a very practical example is how many sellers on Jumia are classified as SMEs? How many sellers on Jumia have been able to get access to working capital loans to grow their businesses? How many sellers on Jumia are women? How many of them have utilized the training facilities that we provide? How many of them have utilized the loans to be able to grow their businesses? Those are huge areas of sustainability that we haven't even scratched all of it, right? Mm-hmm. And for us, let's utilize what we have first. And then there are other levers of which we can also concentrate on. So those are some examples for you there. Yeah.
Thank you. I had another question here about, the complexity of working with so many third parties for logistics and payments. And the question is, and at what point does Jumia decide we should build this in-house versus we should partner? And is that conversation ongoing, or maybe that's a trade secret, but I'm just curious to know.
You have to be comfortable with complexity if you're going to work in Africa. Okay. We love complexity, and we enjoy taking complexity and making it simple. So, like I said earlier, the problem is not assets, right? The problem is not people who have warehouses and hubs. All of that exists. You have people who have warehouses, we have people who have hubs, we have people who have 10 trucks, or some people who have 5 tricycles. We have all of those assets that exist. So replicating on the asset side is not like—
that makes no sense.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not creating value. The real asset that then drives e-commerce is the engine, which is really the technology. Okay. So how do you know which day of the week you can make certain deliveries? What is the speed of delivery? And how should you do your routing so that you're more fuel efficient? You also reduce distance traveled. All of those are relevant information you cannot get through just owning the assets. You get that through owning the technology that puts it all together. And the value is the fact that all those players are utilizing your technology. Okay, so you have the delivery agents who have your delivery app on their mobile phone. You've got the third-party logistics players who are using your hub management system in their businesses. So that's how you create the real value, and that's why we're concentrating there. Yeah.
Yeah. So your data is becoming increasingly valuable and important as well, which for me is a great segue to another question about Jumia's next steps for scaling and growth. Is it about more regional expansion or broader scope of goods and services for the markets where you already are?
Yeah, it's more the second, because all said and done, we are the largest e-commerce platform on the continent, but we're also in a continent where e-commerce, and I would say all of modern trade, is probably still within the ranks of 2 to 5% of total retail. Okay, so you
huge upside.
Huge upside, yes, huge upside. So before you start tinkering with other kinds of categories and new verticals and so on, just even that alone is a significant area to focus on. Yeah, and that's what our focus is. And I think the other thing we are focusing on as well is really the shift that consumers have made from using e-commerce, coming to Jumia to buy the electronics. They wanted to buy products of high value because they could get it at a good price on Jumia, and they could get, the quality assurance and all of that, to the everyday products. So people want to buy food, people want to buy, essential items, home cleaning agents, beauty and perfumes. Consumables, basically. That's a huge shift, and that's where we are also deepening our presence in. Yeah.
So I want to go to the competitive landscape in a second, but I want to pause and talk about consumables, because one of the things that makes consumables possible here in the United States is that you can get it tomorrow, right? You can get your vegetables; they're still fresh, or maybe even cold packed, right? You need a toilet roll, you need cleaning products, whatever it is. Is that a big deal? Is that important to your consumers, that they get something really fast, or not? Not yet.
Yeah, there's always a trade-off. I think sometimes it's your, what's the right word? It's the consumer's living environment that flows into their expectations. Okay, so because in the States, right next the corner, there's either a Kroger, or there's a Target, or there's a Wegmans, or any other brand. Is it Harry Teeter's? I'm trying to remember the name, that you can pop into and buy. So that flows into consumer expectations of, when do I want it? I want it like in 10 minutes. Of course, you can use Instacart as well, and you get the product very quickly. In our environment, is slightly different. Consumers are making trade-offs, and for them, probably the pricing is more important, because consumers want the best pricing. They're fairly happy with convenience, but we also seen some of those expectations of, I want it quick and fast, flowing into consumers' expectations of how they want it delivered. But to a large extent, for consumers, it's the convenience of buying it online and the price point. That's very important. And we also invest in what we have a program we call Phoenix Program, and a Phoenix Program basically tracks about almost 50,000 items that are essentials that consumers want to buy. So basic essentials or bestsellers on Jumia, so that at any point in time, we want a consumer to buy those items on Jumia and save money relative to if they bought it elsewhere. So price is still a big part of the equation for our consumers.
So you think this consumables segment may be growing faster than hard goods?
Oh, we see it already on our platform. Last year, we saw that in terms of items sold in some of our markets, we began to see things like some countries, I can't remember which countries it is, but sugar, peas became top selling items in those countries relative to what it used to be before, where it might have been an electronic product, a mobile phone or something like that. Yeah, and of course in markets like Nigeria, where you have issues with power generation and access to power, the power bank to power your phone was a top selling item in Nigeria last year. We covered all of that in our e-commerce report, e-commerce index report, which we published about 2 or 3 weeks ago.
So I got the perfect question here for you that just follows on this. As part of your impact goals, does Jumia have any special role in supporting or facilitating local manufacturing in the countries where you operate?
We work very closely with brands. So we have several brands that are listed on Jumia. And we see an increasing interest from brands to be on Jumia for many reasons. One being, of course, that it gives an opportunity for them to go direct to the consumer through Jumia as a platform. Two, it gives them very useful consumer insight. And a lot of that consumer insight is in terms of packaging, in terms of product specifications. All of that is useful for a manufacturer in development and product development and production. So yes, I mean, the answer is yes. Local manufacturers find being on Jumia extremely useful for their planning and demand planning and production. Yeah.
Let's pivot a little bit to the competitive landscape. Who are your competitors? Is it Kong.com or Takealot, other e-commerce companies that are in the continent, or is Amazon a threat from afar?
I think when you look at it at the end of the day, competition is more the informal market, right? Because all of that put together, you've just talked about, whether it is Konga or Takealot or any other platform or modern brick and mortar retail and so on and so forth. All of that, like I said earlier, is just 2 to 5% max.
Yeah.
So the real competition is the informal market. And we are every day working to bring more and more sellers through to the platform and bring more brands to the platform, excite more consumers. We're currently having our Black Friday campaign on, and it usually is a very exciting period for consumers.
I had no idea that existed on your platform.
Oh, we were the first to launch it in Africa in 2014.
Around here, that's when I try to go for a hike in the woods because it's too mad everywhere else. Let me ask a bit more about, where does Jumia look for its vision? Do you look more to the East, Chinese e-commerce, like Taobao or JD or Douyin, or do you look more to Western models as you think through your growth strategy?
I would say, honestly, we look more at our consumers than anything else. I mean, it doesn't mean that we don't have parallels with other markets. Sure, when you look at it from the basic e-commerce model, I would say we're much closer to the Asian Alibaba model because we're more of a marketplace. Okay. But then there are structural differences between Africa and China. Some of the infrastructural developments, even things like having a national postal system and driving down the cost of postal services. Some of those things which Taobao, for example, leapfrogged in developing in China, we don't have those in Africa. So we look more at our consumers, I would say, in terms of what are their expectations, what are their needs, what's evolving for them in the market, what's critical than anything else. But yes, like I said, in terms of parallels of the basic e-commerce model itself, yes, pretty similar to the Alibaba kind of model. Yeah.
So, I mean, the other thing, Alibaba is doing this a bit now, but I'm also thinking about this rise of social commerce. So TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook have become major marketplaces, and they connect brands, directly to the consumers. They have so-called influencers as brand ambassadors. Yeah. Is this a threat to Jumia's business model? Is this a direction that you want to go? How do you view social commerce?
We view social commerce as complementary to some respects, in the sense that, there's a lot of social commerce on WhatsApp and Instagram, like you mentioned, but it's also exposed some of the challenges of social commerce in terms of protection of consumers. Sometimes you order something and it doesn't get delivered, and you don't have a system whereby you can trust in the returns process, you can trust in quality assurance and so on. Every time we poll our consumers, they tell us that one of the things they really, really love on Jumia is they don't want to deal with a seller. they don't care who the seller is. Okay, I mean, that's I'm speaking figuratively.
Mm-hmm.
The person they have a relationship with is Jumia. So if something goes wrong, they want to know that it's Jumia they're dealing with. We always talk about the fact that when you're ordering online, that many things we provide, the item is probably being QC'd. You can see the seller score, so you can make decisions between multiple options, which seller to go with, payments and all of that. So there's a whole lot that's riding on just completing a purchase online, that consumers like the option of having someone, the intermediary, the platform that is taking some of those responsibilities for them. Yeah.
Well,
so
let's talk about, sorry, go
that
ahead.
case is still there. I mean, that case is still a valid value proposition for consumers.
So let's talk about trust. I'm a frequent user of Amazon and eBay, and I've been ripped off many times. And there are recourse. There's recourse, but but they're slow and unsatisfactory. How is this going on your platform? Is there a lot of problems?
We have, I mean, for any marketplace, of course, you would have issues sometimes with sellers and so on and so forth. But like you mentioned, we do have recourse mechanisms. We have penalties. We score sellers by many things: by speed of delivery, by the quality of the item, by the return rate of the items that they sell on the platform. So many things are built into it. And of course, we have certain items which must be QC'd. We have manufacturer warranties. We offer everything that you can think of from a recourse perspective. And for some of our consumers also, depending on the type of item and the specific consumer's behavior on our platform, sometimes a consumer wants to return something and we refund immediately, even before the item is retrieved. Okay, so there are many things we've built into creating an environment that consumers can trust and feel comfortable to shop online. Yeah,
that's fascinating. We're sort of at our formal time. So those of you who are tuning into the podcast, either from Stanford or on the YouTube channel, feel free to drop in your questions and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. And then I have a few questions I want to wrap it up with. But first, there's a question here from an anonymous attendee. Can you explain why, as an Africa-focused, Nigerian-led company, Jumia decided to set up its headquarters in Berlin and IPO on the New York Stock Exchange? Why did you choose those locations instead of, for example, Nigeria?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. Don't forget that in terms of registration, we had always been historically registered in Berlin, just because, of course, our first founders and funders, rather, was a German company, and we retained that over time. Okay, so we haven't changed that. Of course, people ask, I remember people have asked this question, why New York? Because when you're going through an IPO process, when you're trying to establish funding for long-term growth of the company, you're also looking for an environment that will not only provide you with capital, but an environment where the investing public, to a large extent, understand the business model, are familiar with that business model, because other companies of the same business model have gone through that environment to seek capital, right? So that's very important. It would have been very new in an African environment. Maybe sometime in the future, we could consider also listing in an African environment. But at that time, it was very important that when you considered London, you considered New York and other capital environments, that New York investing market had a very deep experience with e-commerce. Yeah.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. So another question here. This person is wondering, does Jumia plan on creating any in-house products, considering the relative competitive advantage in labor cost in many African countries?
I can only say at the moment is not one of our key areas of focus. Our key areas of focus right now is actually, like I said, deepening our presence in the markets that we're currently in. And there's still quite a lot of, I would say, potential in terms of assortment in food and basic consumables that consumers want. So, we would be partnering more with sellers and brands, to bring more of that assortment to consumers.
I mean, that makes sense to me, because I think you also have, in 11 countries, you have 11 sets of consumer preferences and cultural preferences. It's not like Amazon making batteries, cheap batteries. It doesn't quite look like that. Another question here: what is the hardest thing about serving the African market?
I would say the hardest thing was gaining the trust of consumers from the beginning. Okay, I still remember that. So that was the hardest thing. And we, as you recall, we offered, and we still offer to some extent, cash on delivery as one of the ways to gain consumer trust. Yes, we invested a lot in offline engagement. We have a J-Force agent network, also to educate consumers and win their trust on the fact that, look, if you order it online, it's going to be safe. Your money isn't going anywhere. And Jumia has the systems and policies in place to handle any problem that you have. So that was number one. The second one was also convincing sellers of a marketplace model. I mean, they're being used for decades to retail. So you come to me, you pay for it, I give it to you, and that's it. We're done, right? But here's a marketplace model that I say, list the products and I'll pay you as you sell. That's a completely different mindset. So those were, I would say, the tougher areas. But over time, we built that trust also on the seller side. And now we have a very vibrant marketplace. Yeah. I
mean, that's a big one, right? So in talking to fintech players in Nigeria, the number one problem they're solving is working capital. And somebody might need $300 to restock their inventory tomorrow, and they actually need that money tomorrow. And they're going to sell those goods the day after tomorrow. And no bank is interested in that business, right?
Yeah.
And so, that has been, I think that's a game changer, right? Because you can never grow if you can never really finance your inventory.
Yeah.
So there was a question here about, to what extent do you believe Jumia will accelerate development in Africa? I can imagine a couple of pathways for that to happen, but I'd like to hear what you think.
I mean, it's already contributing to development on the continent. There was a BCG report that talked about the fact that, look, marketplaces like Jumia by 2025 could be contributing almost 3 million jobs on the continent. So in terms of, you're talking about jobs, that's one. Number two, you're talking about formalizing informal retail, like you mentioned. You also recognize as another area, which is the cross-border trade within Africa itself. So those are many pathways and many areas in which e-commerce and companies like Jumia can make significant contribution to the continent. Yeah. So
Juliet, with our little bit of time left, I want to make another pivot, and I have some questions I was thinking about for our audience. And one is kind of a general question: what does the entrepreneurial ecosystem look like in Lagos right now, where you're based? If you were a young entrepreneur from Nigeria interested in pursuing, scalable, technology-driven innovation, what sorts of resources are available when it comes to advice and funding?
There are many hubs I can certainly talk about, and I'm not holding brief for any particular hub, but I know CC Hub is one of them in Lagos. There are a couple of other hubs as well, and networks where particularly young tech entrepreneurs can find resources, information, and networking environment where they can, meet with funders, they can meet with fellow techpreneurs, as we call them, to exchange ideas and grow their business. So quite a number of them exist in Lagos. I just remember CC Hub that comes to mind readily.
What about do you have some advice for entrepreneurs who are not from Africa, but might be interested in exploring the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Africa? Where would they start? Should they get to know what's going on in a particular city? Or there regional convenings, networks that they should tap into? I'm thinking here about, grad students coming out of school, excited
sure.
about the opportunities on the continent and don't know how to dip their toe in the water.
Yeah, I mean, first things is decide where do you want to pitch your tent, and I can talk about so many areas. I mean, there's agriculture is a big one. Ag tech is a big one that's evolving. Education is another one, and of course healthcare. So this one of the big areas in my view is healthcare, and is really about how do we make more efficient use of the healthcare assets we have on the continent. So any use of technology that frees up doctors' time and uses their time more efficiently, connects people to primary healthcare providers, uses data to help the doctors in making decisions. Those things, I think, are big areas for development on the continent.
I mean, I love all three of those examples because they've turned last mile delivery on its head. Right?
Yeah.
I'm old enough that I remember when we were, World Bank and African Development Bank would put all this money into creating physical infrastructure to get teachers from here to over there, right? And just like nobody, and then years ago I lived in Indonesia, and if you wanted a landline for your phone, you waited 4 years to get the landline installed. Mm-hmm. Nobody has a landline. Who cares, right? So, now not everything can be done remotely, but I am struck by how much of a disruption it is to do last mile delivery of so many services digitally. So I think I'm totally on the same page as you. I'm going to go back to our listeners because it's a very interesting question here for you. I'm just going to read it verbatim. When do you see an inflection point for your business in terms of consumer adoption? Jumia has spent billions of dollars, but there are only 7 million MAUs on the platform. I don't actually know what an MAU is, so maybe you can tell me what that is.
Yeah, an MAU is monthly active users.
Okay.
So, I mean, people think about inflection points, but we just say to ourselves, look, there's a huge opportunity in the market. So I don't predict what an inflection point will be, but all I know is that every day that we are increasing the number of users we have on our platform, we're increasing the assortment that we have, we're increasing the number of sellers, bringing more brands, creating excitement, providing products and at the right prices for consumers. That is all part of the work that needs to be done, and that's what our focus will be for the foreseeable future.
I have another, this is quite a technical question, but I appreciate this one. And it's about delivery and geolocation. I guess your delivery systems also rely on third-party technology. And does that limit what you can do with your geolocation data? This person asked, does geoconnectivity feels like a substantial factor for bringing Africa's domestic economy into the modern age? Can you see Jumia monetizing geolocation data more as a public service, funded by the government?
I mean, geolocation data is great, but this is an environment where we also build solutions around the fact that some consumers just don't have access. They are not covered by postcodes and those kinds of information that make geolocation easy to track, right? So we have pickup stations, and we have delivery agents who are more or less knowledgeable about specific villages and localities where consumers live. You know how it is, who lives behind who, even if there's no formal postal code to deliver there. Yeah. So we have a full round customized solution for the African environment. Maybe in the future, like you said, of course, when there's broad coverage across all locations with all the right codes and so on, yes, we could consider other areas of investment. Yeah.
So I'm waiting to see if any other listeners drop in a question, but I have one of my questions I always ask people near the end is, what question do you wish I had asked you?
That's a good one. You left that one to the end. You actually asked the question, which is where else? So where else should an entrepreneur coming into the market be looking at? And we cover that in terms of agri, healthcare, education, all of those areas. Yeah. Nothing comes to mind.
Okay.
But I hope I have the privilege of, like, one of the students is dropping you a line to say, hey, Darius, you should have asked this question.
Well, I mean, there was an expression of appreciation that Jumia is lifting women-owned businesses with training and flexibility. And I think you mentioned that as a key area in your sustainability goals. So there are some votes of appreciation for that. And from our own personal experience with Stanford Seed, it's extremely important as well. There was also a question about, what is your experience in scaling from Nigeria? We talked about some of the conditions that you looked for, but they're asking very specifically whether currency rates, customs and duties, delivery structures, whether that stuff matters.
To some extent, I would say yes, but they're not roadblocks in terms of how you can scale in the environment. There are always solutions around some of the bottlenecks that we find in the market. Yeah, but those are not showstoppers, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, Juliet, our time is almost up. I wanted to say thank you. Fascinating topic. I've learned a lot, and I hope that our listeners have learned a lot as well. I want to thank all of our listeners for submitting a fabulous set of questions. But this is great. So thank you so much for your time, Juliet Anammah from. And if I may invite Luke to come back to finish this up.
Yeah, thank you first of all so much, Juliet and Darius, for such a rich and enlightening conversation. That was such a treat. Just want to thank our audience again for tuning into this session of the Entrepreneurial Thought Leaders series. Next week, we're going to host our final ETL of 2021, featuring Obvious Ventures co-founder and managing director James Waheen. And you can find that event and all other future events in our ETL series at our Stanford eCorner YouTube channel. And as always, you can find even more of our videos and podcasts and articles about entrepreneurship and innovation at Stanford eCorner. That's Stanford. That's ecorner.stanford.edu. And as always, thank